The opinions expressed in the State of Mind program are those of the speakers. The program is intended for educational and entertainment purposes only. It is not a substitute for consulting a medical or mental health professional. Welcome to State of Mind, Being Human and Living Well, broadcasting on KSQD Santa Cruz on 90.7 FM and live streaming at ksqd.org. I'm the producer and host, Deborah Sloss, licensed marriage and family therapist, and my pronouns are she, her. September is National Suicide Prevention Month, so in today's show, we're focusing our conversation on suicide prevention for teens and young adults. Communities across the U.S. have faced increased mental health challenges related to COVID-19, with teens and young adults being particularly hard hit. In 2020, the proportion of mental health-related emergency room department visits among adolescents, ages 12 to 17, increased by 31% compared with the prior year. Within that group, emergency room visits for suspected suicide attempts was 50.6% higher among girls and 3.7% higher for boys. Young adults have also been impacted, but to a lesser degree. For those ages 18 to 25, the emergency room visit rate for suspected suicide attempts ranged from 1.1 to 1.6 times higher throughout the pandemic when compared with the previous year. These rising mental health and suicide attempt rates are concerning and beg for increased awareness and prevention efforts. Most deaths by suicide are preventable, and that's why we're being joined today by college student Enrique Garcia and mental health educator and advocate Owen Thomas to learn more about what it's like to feel suicidal, where to find help and support, and what you can do to help those who are suffering with suicidal thoughts and feelings. This is part one of a two-part series on suicide, so join us again next month when we focus on complicated grief and the recovery process after losing a loved one to suicide. Let me tell you more about our guest today. Enrique Garcia uses pronouns he, him, and is a senior at UC Santa Cruz who is studying literature and creative writing. Aside from earning straight A's, earning significant scholarships, and being a student worker, he's also struggled with mental health issues since the age of 10. Depression, anxiety, depersonalization, OCD, PTSD, and suicidal ideation are all things that he has experienced or still experiences to this day. In January 2020, he became suicidal due to struggling with months of excruciating pain, which made sleep oftentimes impossible. Working as a teaching assistant and tutor now, Enrique makes an effort to normalize mental health challenges and ensure that students know how to access crisis support. Owen Thomas uses pronouns he, him, and is a mental health educator and advocate. As Community Outreach Coordinator at Suicide Prevention Service of the Central Coast, he hosts educational presentations on suicide prevention for all ages and engages the community around questions of suicide. He's interested in the ways people can stay safe through reaching for each other, as well as addressing stigma around suicide on the community and interpersonal levels. Owen considers mental health stigma an issue of social justice that intersects with other effects of oppression. He's strongly committed to building a world that's more connected and resilient. We're so glad to welcome Owen and welcome back Enrique, since he was an In Your Voice contributor on a previous State of Mind show, episode 19 about teens and anxiety. So welcome to you both.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for having me.
So glad we're here, and I'm so glad we're going to talk about this really important topic. And as I mentioned in the intro, especially important right now. So, Owen, let's start with you. Can you give a picture of how significant a problem the suicidal feelings are for teens and young adults?
Yeah, so I'll start by just talking about sort of on a global level. Suicidal ideation, as well as death by suicide, rank as both a common sort of mental illness that young people experience, as well as a common cause of death. And so from country to country, the trends are pretty clear. Suicide stands as one of the most common causes of death for people aged 15 to 29. In the US, I believe it's the second. And I think globally, just taken as an average, it's second as well. And then just across age groups in general, suicide was the cause of 47,500 deaths in the US in 2019. And I wasn't able to find numbers for 2020, but I'm going to guess that number didn't decrease because of the ways that the pandemic induced isolation sort of impacted everybody's mental health. And so one thing that has been very clear is that suicide rates for teens and young adults has been on the rise since 2000 in the US. Again, with no existing studies to track that rise through 2019 and 2020. And so again, my guess is that the pandemic hasn't, reduced that increase. If anything, it's exacerbated it. If you look just at Santa Cruz County locally, you'll see that in 2019, the county drafted a strategic plan on suicide prevention, in which we were able to notice just a trend overall in suicide attempts, as well as deaths by suicide. However, the age demographics in that don't necessarily show an increase in teen and young adult suicides, but I think a lot of that has to do with just generally demographics in Santa Cruz and population representations. It's such a small, number that it's hard to track trends the same way you would if we were talking about California, for instance. But I do think that regardless of what the numbers show for Santa Cruz County locally, I think people are going to be affected by very similar, sort of issues here as they would on, national level or a statewide level, because the issue of mental health stigma is so far reaching, right? And so I think that is definitely still happening in Santa Cruz. And of course, we also need to think about the way that reporting even happens when it comes to suicide deaths and when it comes to experiences of suicidal ideation. There's a lot that gets in the way of getting accurate numbers. So yeah, that's a sort of brief summary of sort of the extent of the issue. And, just the fact that it's the second leading cause of death for teens and young adults, in the US, I think shows just how mental health is so front and center when it comes to issues that affect young people, because it's not physical ailments that's going to cause. I mean, they certainly can, but when we're talking about the whole population, it's going to be mental health that is going to have a really great impact on people.
Wow, that gives a really good picture of why it's so important to be talking about it right now. Do you have any insight about who in this group, when we're talking about teens and young adults, who's most at risk?
It's a great question. I mean, I think when we talk about risk, we just have to talk about all the overlapping identities that people have. So for example, again, when we're talking about on a global level, when we look at rich and poor countries, for example, poor countries tend to show higher rates of suicide than rich countries. And that same sort of logic applies to countries as well when it comes to class. So for lower income people, we're going to see higher rates of suicide or higher suicide risk than higher income people. And that's just going to work all the way up to the top, basically. And then when we're talking about sort of race and ethnicity, numbers are sort of hard to come by because race and ethnicity is so complex. But when we're talking about sort of like large groups, we see that indigenous people are at the highest risk of suicide in the US. And from there, we have people who are white, Asian American and Pacific Islander people, Latinx people, and then Black people. And so that's how suicide risk breaks down when it comes to race and ethnicity. And I don't want to highlight those numbers to say that, therefore, these are how we prioritize mental health access or equity to populations. More so, I'm talking about just sort of the phenomenon in general. And so when it comes to gender, one thing that is really notable is just the fact that LGBTQ people, LGBTQ youth specifically, are 4 times more at risk than their straight identifying peers. And that's a number that I found through the Trevor Project, which is an organization that does sort of survey work and research on LGBTQ youth. And then amongst, when we look at sort of research that's looking at people as they identify according to biological sex, these research findings are sort of reductive, they're not encompassing the full gender spectrum, but they do pull out some interesting sort of, insights about the way that, for example, people who are assigned female report higher rates of suicide ideation and attempts. People who are assigned male report higher deaths by suicide, but lower rates of suicidal ideation and attempts. And so that's actually a gender paradox that we see a lot in the field of suicide prevention. And so I didn't necessarily tell you who is most at risk, but I was able to show you some of just the factors that are affecting people in general. These are sort of the big sort of social factors that are affecting folks.
And then within the teens to young adult age bracket, is there any particular age group that is more or less at risk?
That's a great question. I think, and this is just my intuition, so actually take this with a grain of salt, because I haven't pulled up any research to back this up, but I do think that as we move sort of out of late adolescence and into teenage years, like pre-teens through teenage years, I think risk just tends to increase. And I think that's just because this sort of like experience of coming into adulthood is a really, really challenging transition. Teens are being introduced to all kinds of aspects of public life that's really confusing and hard to think about. And they're usually doing so while experiencing, being children and lacking a lot of autonomy, lacking access to a lot of institutional care, and in general, not knowing how they can necessarily get support because they just lack experience, just like anybody else, coming into their world at that age. And so that's sort of my intuition says that it's going into those teenage years that risk definitely increases.
You're tuned to listener-supported 90.7 FM KSQD Santa Cruz, K-Squid. Many voices, one station. And this is State of Mind, Being Human and Living Well. I'm your host, Deborah Sloss, and I'm here talking with mental health educator and advocate, Owen Thomas, and college student and mental health survivor, Enrique Garcia. Stay with us to learn more about what leads to suicidal feelings, where to find help, and what you can do to help those who are suffering with them. We'll be right back after this brief message from our underwriter.
KSQD thanks Family Service Agency of the Central Coast for supporting this program. Family Service Agency provides counseling and support for people of all ages facing life crises and challenges. You can reach them at 423-9444 to see if they can help you. Thank you, Family Service Agency of the Central Coast, for supporting KSQD 90.7 FM.
Now, back to our interview. So, Enrique, I'd like to turn to you because we are so appreciative that you're coming on the show, that you came on the show today to talk about your own experience of feeling suicidal, a subject that most of us would find quite hard to talk about. But it is so important to bring this common experience into the open in order to help save lives. So I thank you for being here and being willing to share your difficult experiences. Can you tell us about what was going on in your life when you went through a time of feeling actively suicidal?
Yeah, so for me, what happened was beginning in November of 2019, all the way through January of 2020, I suffered with severe calf spasms that lasted 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And they were as a result of not taking care of my body, particularly when I was dealing with extreme OCD. I was cooped up in the house much of the day, and because I had a fear of going outside. And so once or twice a week, I would go outside and try to get all of my energy out. And because not only was I afraid of going outside, but I was also afraid of germs, I was terrified of putting on shoes for fear of the process of like using your hands and your fingers and touching the bottom of your feet and things like that. And so I found a way around that, which was through hiking in flip-flops, and turned out not to be a good idea in the long run, because I was doing it at least once or twice a week up at UCSC, where it's very hilly, and I would do it for about anywhere from 4 to 5 miles twice a week in flip-flops. And doing that consistently in 2018, I believe, for 2 months before I ended up going to a OCD hospital, ended up to this day really harming both of my Achilles. So 2 years later, initially the pain began in 2018. 2 years later, roughly 2 years later, in November of 2019, they somehow came back again, and I'm not sure why, but they ended up coming back, and the pain was just like it was back then, where it was extremely disabling, extremely draining, and it left me to the point where it was so painful to even walk that I would spend about 12 hours per day literally just on the couch in my living room, looking out the sliding glass door. I literally watched the seasons change from my couch. I remember looking outside and seeing, the fall colors of this tree eventually become bearless, and there was a barren, and there was nothing on the tree itself other than, the tree. There's no, leaves or anything like that. And it got worse in regards to like my physical ailments about 2 months in. And this led me to actually have to use a wheelchair, and it was something that I never thought I would ever have to do, but it was something that I did have to do in order to get around, because it was really depressing, literally being on a couch half the day, having pain 24/7. And so I wanted to get out. And so my brother would, I live with my parents, with my mom and my brother. And so in order to get out, my mom would like pull up to as close as we could to the front of the house, and then drive me to wherever I wanted to go. And then they would take the wheelchair out of the back of the car, and then I would get out of the car and then sit down, and my brother would like, I guess, like push me or whatever. And it was a very bittersweet moment, like being able to go outside, but also recognizing that I am coming to terms with the fact that I am very physically disabled. And just the stigma of like not being able to get around on your 2 feet. I definitely noticed that people didn't treat you the same. They like walked around you. They didn't look at you. Sometimes they would stare. All of these things just coming together really made me more aware of not only being more empathetic to people who are struggling with psychological illnesses, but also physical illnesses as well, because it can literally happen to anyone. So the turning point actually came in January, where I felt like giving up. I was losing a lot of mental stamina. During the first couple of months, I was able to somehow find a way to get through it and almost treat it like a challenge or something that would quote unquote make me stronger, even though I don't believe in that mantra now. And so January was the time where I felt like I had no reserve. I could not last much longer. And that's when I began thinking of, well, how could I end things? How could I end my life? And I ended up thinking that, probably the quickest and less painful way to do it would be through just using a gun right through the head. Thankfully, I didn't purchase a gun. I didn't create like a plan of where I would buy it or where I would do it, the actual plan, because I know that that means that I'm further far gone. But it's interesting, like right at the point where I felt like I was giving up, the pain just stopped. And it's something that I did not expect. I mean, every single night I would literally pray to a higher power, even though I don't believe in like a God. I'm more of like spiritual, I guess you could say, just believing in the fact that there's higher powers looking out for everyone in one aspect or another. And so I would pray, like saying like, listen, like, please help me. I would literally pray out loud as I would be looking up at my ceiling, about to go to bed. And eventually, I guess, my prayers were answered. And about a few days before the pain actually stopped, something very, very rare happened. So I'm not sure if you all are birders by chance, or people who are like birds and know them and know their calls and everything. But there's this type of hummingbird that is extremely rare. It's called the white hummingbird. And there's only been 100 recorded sightings in the entire Americas. So North America, Central America, South America, 100. And a couple days before I felt like basically giving up, I was sitting on my couch in my living room, looking out my sliding glass door, as I always do. And we have a lot of plants that like attract hummingbirds, but I'd never seen a white hummingbird before. And literally out of nowhere, it just came to me. And it was trying to get nectar from one of these plants. And I looked at it oddly. I'm like, wait, what? What is that? Are you sick? Like, do I need to call animal rescue? Because I'd never seen a hummingbird that looked like that. And then sure enough, I told my mom, and she's like, oh yeah, they're famous because one was recently sighted at the Arboretum. And so the fact that this very rare creature, who is very resilient, if we think about it, I mean, they're able to do things that most creatures cannot. They're the only creature that can like fly backwards, for instance. And they, can travel up to 80 miles an hour. Their heart beats extremely quickly. And they are just beautiful creatures. And so I took that as a sign of like, don't give up, birders can literally spend their entire careers looking for this hummingbird, and I didn't have to look at all. It just came to me. And so I think of it as like a sign that, I shouldn't give up. And that there was some form of higher power, like looking out for me and making sure that I didn't. So that was my story. To this day, I still struggle with, physical pain as a result of those Achilles injuries that I struggled with. I'm not able to walk more than about 20 minutes, probably every day. It's actually pretty intense, but it's nothing in comparison to what I felt back in 2020.
Wow. Thank you, Enrique, for sharing that story. Really moving story. I heard about that hummingbird, never got to see it, but it was among people who love birds. It was definitely big news. Amazing that you had that experience. I'd like to come back to you, and you had just been telling us about your experience of having that injury and really becoming so physically disabled, and then really having it affect your mental health to the point that you were thinking about giving up. And I'm wondering, had you ever been exposed to anyone who committed suicide in the past? And do you think that had an effect on your thinking at all?
Yeah, so I know that I have family members who, have experienced suicidal ideation, but I'm not really that comfortable disclosing more about them. But at the same time, I think I can definitely say that I honestly didn't know that they were suicidal until after I was suicidal. Even though I had been told that one of my family members was suicidal when they were younger, I must have forgotten. And so I'm not sure exactly how to answer that question. But in general, I've been through a lot, not just in regards to suicidal ideation, but things prior. And so I feel like I'd been through the ringer and I was capable of being able to overcome this, even though it was very difficult. So I think that's how I would answer that question.
Well, clearly, Enrique, you believe it's important to be here talking about this, even though it's a difficult topic to discuss. So can you share why you think it's important to talk about it publicly like this?
Mhm. Yeah, I would say that probably the reason why I'm more outspoken about this than I was when I was like before 10 or whatever was because I've realized that my situation is very much our situation, where it's not just one individual or a handful of individuals who are struggling with mental illnesses. It's millions, if not billions, of people around the entire world. And so with that, I feel like it's almost everyone's obligation, allies, and individuals like myself who have experienced certain issues in regards to mental health, to really speak up and try to fight the stigma. Because my belief is that the more that you talk about something and you normalize it, the less that people see it as something that is to be feared or things like that. Because I definitely experienced in my past where I have been open to others about things that I have been through, and I end up getting ostracized. Basically, what that means is like being ghosted by people, and I would say that that's just a microcosm of the larger whole. I would say that our society still to this day, like global society, still do not treat physical conditions and mental conditions as the same. Just looking at, for instance, a little example, someone who's struggling with cancer, you'd want to say, oh, it's very like outspoken, like, oh, I'm going through cancer. And then if you get through it, hopefully you do, everyone like comes and celebrates. Versus for me, like with my OCD, or anyone, and I think it's safe to say, if you're going through something like any form of mental health, it becomes more of like a secret or something that one needs to feel like shameful about, because others are going to judge you. And then if you tell others about it, then you could bear the consequences of that.
You're tuned to listener-supported 90.7 FM KSQD K-Squid, community radio for the Monterey Bay. And this is State of Mind, being human and living well. We're also live streaming over the web at ksqd.org. You can find this or any past episode of our show on Apple and Google Podcasts and on the KSQD website. I'm your host, Deborah Sloss, and I'm here talking with mental health educator and advocate Owen Thomas and college student and mental health survivor Enrique Garcia. Stay with us to learn more about recognizing when a loved one might be feeling suicidal, where to find help and support, and what you can do to help those you care about. I want to remind listeners that every State of Mind show has a resource list posted along with the show. And the resources we talk about today can be found on the post for this show at ksqd.org/state of mind. Now, back to our interview. Owen, as you listen to Enrique's story, I'm wondering what aspects of his experience seemed common to you and what maybe unique about his experience. Like, does anything stand out that illustrates what you've seen in working with teens and young adults around suicide prevention?
That's a really good question. I mean, yeah, the first thing that really stood out is the difference between someone telling their story and talking about statistics or, large phenomena like Enrique, like your story is so unique, it's so compelling, and like it's really human. And like I felt, chills listening to you talking about sort of your experience. And yeah, and so I mean, the commonalities are just sort of what Enrique was talking about in terms of mental health stigma, the way that it is considered sort of a lesser, handicap than other forms of able-bodiedness or yeah, or lack of able-bodiedness. And I think it really also shows how much people who are experiencing mental illness have a lot in common, and there's a lot of sort of carryover to people who are, physically disabled. Um, and so I think that's just a really unique experience and an experience that highlights sort of the commonalities of people facing sort of different and overlapping forms of, marginalization. Um, and I think what I found interesting about Enrique's story too was the way that, what we would consider sort of a physical disability completely sort of overlaps with, sort of mental health, and how we can't think about mental health in a vacuum when we're not also thinking about people's bodies and, the way that trauma affects the way we relate to our bodies and the way we take care of our bodies. So yeah, I think there's just so many things to pull out of that. And then just in terms of like the age component of it, yeah, I think that just the fact that, you know, I I'm not pulling out any really, really clear sort of, takeaways about how being a young adult sort of how Enrique's story illuminates unique aspects of being a young adult, besides the fact that that's just sort of where you're at, Enrique, and you're going through the world and going through college, with this sort of disabling experience. And I mean, I think it's common for a lot of young adults to feel like, well, I have to stay on track even while this is just happening, even while this like terrible, challenging experience is happening. And Enrique, you didn't speak to this in detail, but just the fact that, you're currently in college and, you've been going through the school system while experiencing this is like, that's a huge aspect of this that I can't even imagine, the struggle of having to remain committed to that. Or even, you didn't mention where you were at in the process, but if you had to take a leave of absence, the way that impacts you too. So, I mean, I'm really curious about that because that's one aspect of sort of the, teen and young adult experience that I think is really common. It's just going through the school system and being kind of shepherded towards adulthood in that way and having to deal with a bunch of other things while having to do that.
I'm so glad you brought that up, Owen. I just think about in my own work with teens and college students, the huge overlapping concern when they are having mental health issues is about falling behind, taking a break. What would it mean to prioritize my mental health over, progressing in college or in school or even graduating with my peers? I mean, a lot of those become these compounding concerns. Whereas often, if it was a physical ailment, it would be more clear, those choices, or those necessities. And that, really speaks to the stigma too. And I also think about, sense of self-worth. I mean, sometimes they're, for that age group, their whole sense of my worthiness is how well I do at this thing that I'm working at. And therefore, if I'm not doing well, I'm not worthy. And so, they can feel like their life depends on a final. I mean, I've seen that many times. And, it's hard to help them put that into perspective at that point in their lives sometimes because they just don't have life experience outside of that. That's been the primary focus of their lives. So I'm so glad you highlighted that because I certainly have seen that phenomena. I'm wondering, Owen, can you speak to Like, do you think that teens and young adults usually show signs when they're struggling with suicidality? And what would be some of those signs that people that love them and care about them might see?
That's a really good question. Yeah. Again, I don't have I don't have research findings for this, unfortunately. I can speak from just sort of personal experience and from intuition, which is just that um, I think that teens and young adults are just as prone to hiding and suppressing feelings as adults in certain ways. Though at the same time, I think that developmentally, like, I think it's actually common for teens and young adults to have more access to forms of expression than adults and be granted more access to expression just on a cultural level. Um, However, I do think that teens and young adults experience sort of the unique, uh, like the unique experience of having their sort of voices and their stories sort of marginalized and seen as less important, and so I think there's sort of a paternalistic quality to the way people can relate to teens and young adults reaching for help, where they say like, you know, I need help, and that could be interpreted as, oh, this person's going through a phase, or they're just going through a hard time. This is a thing that they're going to transition out of naturally, and it doesn't actually require the same level of care as if an adult was saying that I need help, you know. Um, and so, yeah, I think, teens and young adults have sort of the unique position of maybe actually being allowed to say more, but their voices aren't necessarily heard as easily. Um, and so when it comes to actually some signs, I mean, I think teens and young adults sort of display really similar signs as anyone else. It could be, drawing away from others, isolating, significant mood changes, not eating as much, eating a lot, a changing relationship to substance use, like all that stuff. But I do think that all of that is going to manifest in different ways, just because I think that teens and young adults, they have different sort of social networks. They relate to people differently. They might be a lot more online than older people, so they might actually be displaying these warning signs in sort of online spaces, and so there's definitely a lot to consider, but I think that there's so many commonalities too in terms of like how warning signs actually show up.
The message I'm really hearing from you is take it seriously. Even if it's coming from a teen or young adult, it's really important to consider that those expressions need to be taken seriously.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, check your biases. When you hear a teen on a chat board saying, I want to take my life, do you take it as seriously as an adult in a meeting saying, I want to take my life? You know, do you respond to it with the same level of interest and earnestness and urgency?
Enrique, as Owen talked about some of those signs, do you think you displayed any of those signs? And did you reach out to others when you were struggling with suicidal thoughts or feelings?
I only reached out to those that I trusted, in regards to, like, I mean, I think that that was because of the stigma that is surrounds mental health. So I guess you could say yes. In some ways, I did kind of isolate myself from the outside world. Really, the only people that I fully trusted were my two mothers and my brother. And I really didn't have as much mental capacity also to reach out to others as well. Um, so it was twofold in regards to why I didn't really reach out to people outside of my family. First one was the stigma associated with mental health, and the second one was what I just talked about. And so for me, I guess now listening to what Owen's saying about some of the warning signs in regards to like isolation or eating habits, for sure, I definitely exhibited both of those. I isolated myself from friends, from extended family members, and I ate more out of anxiety. And I think that's a very common phenomenon. It's like a survival mechanism. Your body is in distress, and it's just trying to find a way to give you some extra energy. And so those are two of the things that I definitely exhibited. I'm sure there were more warning signs as well. I mean, one of them was like, coming up with like how I was gonna, end my life, things like that. But I didn't really tell others that, oh, I was gonna use a gun or things like that. Again, I kind of just um, only let the information, only let certain people know what I was going through.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering, when you did reach out to other people and let them know what you were going through, what was your experience of that?
Yeah, so for me, I was lucky enough to feel comfortable letting my family members know what it was that I was going through. And I think that the reason why was because I have been through many difficult psychological struggles in the past, um, being hospitalized twice for anxiety and severe OCD, dealing with depersonalization, like I mentioned, um, dealing with PTSD as a result of getting hit by a baseball, 100-mile-an-hour baseball at a minor league game by Pablo Sandoval. Before he became pro, he was in the San Jose Giants, and I was sitting right behind the third base dugout, right where the netting cut off. And he had a line drive to right here, which is my right where my left eyebrow is. And if it was just a few centimeters down, I would have lost my eye. To this day, I'm still partially blind because of that injury. And because of that, I've struggled with some forms of like PTSD, fear of like being in spaces where there are things that are flying around. PE is my worst nightmare, for instance. And then just general like reliving that over and over. Like whenever I like touch that area, I avoid touching it because it's numb and just re-triggers that area. So, like I mentioned, so dealing with the OCD, dealing with depersonalization, dealing with PTSD, I felt like they were there for me for all of those things and very supportive. And so I felt like this is just one more thing that they'll be supportive of. And so I didn't have really any fear of like being ostracized or them trying to discredit whatever I was saying. So in that regard, I was quite lucky because I know that it could have gone the opposite way if I had different family members.
I understand you also reached out to a Lifeline hotline, and I know it's not easy to ask for help when you feel really vulnerable. And I'm wondering what helped you to be able to reach out and ask for help like that?
I mean, at this point, for me, it was less about worrying about what others thought to an extent and more about just having to do it. And knowing that that lifeline was there was a lifeline. I mean, and so I would call them at least like one time a week per week, usually during the evening when my mind was already very worn out. And I would tell them what I'm going through, and they would never discredit me. They would never question me in a way where I felt like they're trying to gaslight me. They would always be very empathetic and nurturing. And because of that, I think it was definitely something that helped me get through this very difficult time. I wonder if I even maybe talked to Owen, honestly. Who knows? Because, I've called them so many times that I've memorized their phone number.
You're tuned to listener-supported 90.7 FM KSQD, K-Squid, many voices, one station. And this is State of Mind, being human and living well. We're also live streaming over the web at ksqd.org. I'm your host, Deborah Sloss, and I'm here talking with mental health educator and advocate Owen Thomas and college student and mental health survivor Enrique Garcia. Stay with us to learn more about suicide prevention for teens and young adults, In this next segment, we'll be discussing the role stigma plays and talking about supports and resources available. Stay with us to learn more, and we'll be right back after this brief message from our underwriter.
KSQD thanks Pajaro Valley Prevention and Student Assistance, or PVPSA, for supporting State of Mind. PVPSA partners with local schools and agencies to provide no-cost mental health services, substance abuse prevention education, and counseling for youth and their families. More information is available at pvpsa.org. That's pvpsa.org. Thank you, PVPSA, for supporting community radio. K-Squid 90.7 FM.
Back to our interview. I wanted to just ask you, Owen, we've heard a lot about Enrique's experience, and I realize that we haven't really talked about why do teens and young adults become suicidal and start having those thoughts and feelings. And I'm wondering if you could just give us an idea about the reasons why.
Yeah, this is a great question. And I want to start off by just looking at the phrasing, right? So, why is a really hard question for anyone when it comes to suicide, because why brings into question, values and ethics and morals. Why did you do this instead of that? And I'm not saying that to say it's a bad question. It's more so it points to the fact that suicide is going to be a really unique experience for everybody. Suicidal feelings, it's going to come down as much to factors that are affecting them, just out in the world, as much as the way that they're processing them and internalizing them and weighing them. So why for everybody is going to be very unique. It's going to be a story, just like Enrique's story, and the why might change for them as they go through their life and reinterpret those events and think about them, in terms of, the factors that affect young people, teens and young adults. I mean, a lot of what I imagine to be, a significant stressor for all, teens and young adults is that experience of transitioning from childhood to adulthood, and just culturally not having access to sort of, institutions that are geared to support that transition when it comes to mental health. I mean, kids are going through school, but schools aren't necessarily trauma informed. Schools don't necessarily have licensed, clinical therapists for every classroom. Schools don't necessarily have, teachers who are trained in suicide prevention, who are trained in assessment and safety planning. So we have children who are being supported through, the transition into adulthood, but that support isn't bolstered by an awareness of what mental health is and how to support someone who might be experiencing mental illness. So I think that that's a huge thing, is that kids might have access to institutions, but those institutions might not actually be that informed of what they could be going through, and so I think that's a huge thing to, consider when talking about the issues that affect young people. And I mean, on top of that, teens and young adults, they don't have the types of agency that adults have when it comes to accessing resources
or changing their circumstances.
Exactly. I mean, they have to get a parental sign off on many things. And what happens when your home is abusive? What happens when it's not a safe environment? What happens when your parents don't actually believe that what you're experiencing is real? So a lot of these things come down to, really complicated sort of environmental and social issues that all sort of have to be disentangled on their own in order for something, better to come out of it.
Along those lines, I'm wondering, if listeners were to have a friend or a loved one who might be expressing some suicidal thoughts or feelings, what can they do?
It's a great question. I mean, Enrique, in his story, he brought up how he had trust, in his parents, that they would actually be able to listen and support him in a way that was non-judgmental. And I think that's huge, just knowing that there's trust there, that this person has been there for you before. Or even if this person hasn't explicitly been there for you before, if they've said in the past, hey, if you're going through anything, just talk to me, So even if it's not, personal experience, but just sort of, showing that there is an opportunity there to connect is huge. And again, listening non-judgmentally, telling the person that there's not their fault for experiencing that they're not wrong or, doing something immoral for considering taking their life, and actually approaching the question of their suicidality, not from the point of how can we fix you? How can we get you away from this, to what can we do? Just what can we do to make you feel safer right now? I'm not going to completely change your mindset. I'm not going to convince you out of feeling suicidal, but rather I'm going to show you that I'm there for you, that I want to help you, that I want you to be safe right now, and that I'm willing to do things to facilitate that, you know?
Oh, and I know that you started your work with suicide prevention as a hotline volunteer. Can you describe the kinds of support that's available for teens and young adults who are feeling suicidal when they might call a hotline or a helpline?
Yeah. So, I mean, it started off, let's say, a teen or young adult calls the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. They'll be connected to a call center that's local to their region, or the most local call center to their region. And they'll speak with, yeah, like you were saying, a volunteer who's trained to support someone through suicidal crisis, offer them non-judgmental listening, ask them questions to give the volunteer a sense of what that person's, risk is, what their needs are actually going to be, come up with a safety plan for them that's actually going to work for them, and actually going to be the thing that they can sort of hold on to as they sort of move through this challenging experience. So they're going to do all those things, and it's going to be really helpful. And alongside that, if they're calling someone who's sort of local to their region, that person is likely also going to have knowledge of resources that they can take advantage of, whether it just be sort of a, for example, a national resource like the California Teen Line, or I want to say the California Youth Crisis Line. Or, for example, in Santa Cruz County, it could be the Mobile Emergency Response Team for Youth, which is MERTI. And that's sort of a van outfitted with all kinds of sort of like tools and things that, someone would need to actually respond to a crisis, as well as 2 trained mental health professionals. And so, by calling the National Lifeline, you're actually going to be able to get connected to local resources too. And so that is, that's how a young person can be connected and supported through resources that are actually geared towards young people.
Yeah, I want to just highlight something that you mentioned, because teens sometimes are a lot more comfortable with texting. And I did want to make sure that they understand that you can not only call, but you can also have a conversation via text. Is there anything more you want to say about that?
Yeah, so the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline also has a text line, I believe, and I would want the listeners to go onto the website and double check this, that you text home in all caps to 741-741, and you'll get connected to a crisis counselor who is going to work with you exactly the same way they would over the phone. The only difference is they're going to be doing it through text.
Well, we're coming to the end of our time, and there's been sort of references here and there to some resources, and I'm wondering if there are any specific resources that either of you want to share and highlight that we will be sure to include on the resource list posted with the blog for this show. Enrique?
Yes. So one of the resources that I would like to mention would be Psychology Today. So it's a great website where you can find therapists and I believe also psychiatrists that are in your vicinity, in your region, and you can choose what skills you want the therapist to have. You can choose even parts of their background and identity and things like that to make it more tailored to who you want to be helped by. And then another thing that I would recommend is there are mental health facilities that can help people who are struggling with suicide. When I was attending this OCD clinic, which isn't actually called an OCD clinic, it's called Rogers Behavioral Health, I learned that this health center not only helps people who are struggling with OCD, but they also help people struggle with a variety of other struggles, and that includes suicidal ideation. And so there's one in the Bay Area in Walnut Creek, California. And there's also one in Oconomowoc, Wisconsin. And so Rogers Behavioral Health is something that I know for a fact has helped people I know who have had these ideations get through them. And so those would be the two resources that I would recommend.
Owen, any specific resources that you are aware of and have used or have experience with that you'd like to recommend?
I mean, most obviously is the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. And that is 800-273-8255. You can call if you're feeling suicidal, or if you're not feeling suicidal, or if you have a loved one who's feeling suicidal. Alongside that, the My3 app. So it's an app that you can download on your phone. It's called My3, and that's MY and then the number 3. And it's an app for safety planning. So basically it's a very intuitive sort of way of documenting who do you call if you're feeling like you want to take your life, or if you're experiencing suicidal feelings of any kind, and then what can you do? And so it's a way of sort of cataloging that stuff beforehand. So if you know you're a person who experiences sort of periodic suicidal ideation, you have a place to go that's just sort of in your pocket. So I think the My3 app is really, really great. And last but not least, I want to give a shout out to the Trans Lifeline, just because I think people who are trans or gender nonconforming don't have access to a lot of resources that are specifically geared towards their experience. And that the number for that lifeline is 877-565-8860. And all of the responders are either trans or non-binary people. And I just think they're a great organization, so I like to shout them out.
I want to say a huge thank you to our guests today, Owen Thomas and Enrique Garcia, for this honest and heartfelt conversation. And thanks to you for joining us here on State of Mind, Being Human and Living Well. We hope that you found the show to be informative, and that after listening, you may feel just a little bit more equipped to reach out and support someone you know who's struggling with mental health challenges and may be having suicidal thoughts. Join us again next month as we continue this important conversation on suicide with part 2, when we focus on complicated grief and the recovery process after losing a loved one to suicide. To hear more conversations about mental health and wellness, join us on the first Sunday of every month from 6 to 7 p.m. right here at K-Squid 90.7 FM. Special thanks to Jeannie Baldzikowski for audio production, and to Jennifer Young, who assists with research and outreach. And thanks to acoustic guitarist Adrian Legg for composing, performing, and donating the use of our theme music. You can find all the past episodes of this show on our ksqd.org website, or subscribe and get them delivered directly to your listening device on either Apple or Google Podcasts, or listen through your home smart speaker just by saying, play State of Mind Podcast with Deborah Sloss on TuneIn. If you like this or any previous State of Mind episodes, please help the shows get heard by more listeners by leaving us a rating and a review on Apple and Google Podcasts, or submit your comment at the bottom of the post for any episode at ksqd.org/State of Mind. This is listener-supported community radio, KSQD Santa Cruz. Just remember, 90.7 FM, K-Squid, your ink spot on the dial. Stay with us.